Hello, and welcome to your online lecture. As I mentioned last week, I wanted to make sure that I posted a lecture for you also we don't get behind, even though, again, we will not meet in class February 17th and February 19th. So as we've been discussing the long-term causes for the American Revolution, we've looked at a number of different factors. Remember, there are a number of different events that are creating conditions for the revolution. We should remember that there are plenty of those living in the British colonies that do not support the war, that prior to the American Revolution, as we've discussed in class, there were a number of slave rebellions, poor people's rebellions, people rising up against the colonial elite and legislators. There is a religious rebellion of the Great Awakening occurring. So rebellions are quite pervasive before the American Revolution. And one of the things to remember is that after the American Revolution, they continue to develop themselves in a steady stream. There will be slave rebellions, rebellions by Native Americans, rebellions by workers, leading up to the Civil War. So many of the issues causing the revolution are not going to be dealt with through the creation of a new country. And we're going to spend some time looking at that as well when we get back. But just as a reminder, as we talked about in class, the American colonies are very much governed by this concept known as salutary neglect. And between around 1713 and the 1730s, the American colonists did not get much intervention from the British government for a number of reasons. But that really starts to change, as we talked about before, because of the French and Indian War and the British Global 7 Years' War. Excuse me. And the increasing war debt that the British government has accrued by waging war on numerous continents across the globe. The end of salutary neglect, as we talked about before, came with a new imperative by Parliament to levy taxes and to try to get the colonists to pay basically for their massive war debt. So in order to do this, they pass a series of new taxes. I'm just going to go over some of them very briefly for you today. One is the Currency Act. This restricted colonial printing of paper money. They wanted to have colonists pay with hard currency like gold coins. They wanted gold and silver since it's a lot easier to be imported than paper money. The Sugar Act is passed in the same year. And this is the first act ever passed that specifically raised revenue for the British monarchy. And it also was collecting duties that the colonists had not had to pay for years. So you can imagine that the Sugar Act is levied mostly on booze and alcohol, specifically rum, molasses. So this is going to have a real impact on people's ability to purchase it in the same quantities that they were doing before. Another act that is of particular, that finds a lot of resistance amongst colonists, particularly in Boston, was the Quartering Act. And this act said that if British troops needed a place to stay, either a night or a meal, that colonists were required by law to basically put them up. And as I mentioned in class the other day, the British militia had a reputation for being quite sort of frat boyish, is one way to describe it. They were kind of raucous. They were known for drinking, sort of being vulgar. And and outright sort of physical with the people of Boston. So to bring these troops into your home was quite an imposition for many colonists who did not enjoy their company. So this is one other specific act that really upsets those living in Boston. But of course, it's important to remember that these acts are affecting people across the colonies very different. So the Quartering Act for those in Boston was quite something that generated a lot of hostility. If you were in South Carolina, you probably didn't feel any effects of this, right? So it really depends on where one was in the colony as to how much the taxation and this new era of Parliament being very much engaged, how much that was affecting you. The Stamp Act of 1765 really was the most impactful piece of taxation across the colonies. And the purpose was really raise revenues to support new military forces in the colony. So they are putting a stamp on all official papers. This applied to legal documents, pamphlets, anything printed, playing cards, licenses, birth certificate, anything. Excuse me. So this, again, was something that everyone felt. There were those who believed it was reasonable and just, but others really saw, like Patrick Henry from Virginia, saw the Stamp Act as encroaching on colonials' rights. And you really start to see a mantra or slogan, if you will, because all wars have a slogan, that becomes tied to the cause, which is no taxation without representation. This is an interesting idea because the colonists do have some representation in Parliament. They just don't like their representation. They wanted direct representation. They wanted people from the colonies to represent them. That they had representation, but these people weren't of the colony. So this is where this idea really starts to take shape. And after the Stamp Act, you start to see colonies around North America bringing together delegates, Massachusetts down to Virginia. And they really are starting to create a movement for independence. As the Zen textbook really does a good job of laying this out, that at the same time this is going on, there is class conflict that is very prevalent throughout the colonies. And it seems like this could have also had, if the colonists hadn't pointed their weapons towards the British, they could have pointed their weapons at each other, because there's a proliferation of guns. There is a lot of willingness to use them. There's a lot of people who are skilled at their guns. So there is a sort of a culture of violence that is sort of prevalent across here as well as little groups coming together. So in the aftermath of the Stamp Act, you see the emergence of the Sons of Liberty. Liberty is the word that is used the most during this time. Sons of Liberty represented a group. They build a building known as Liberty Hall. They ring the Liberty Bell. They're going to gather by the Liberty Tree. So this term, liberty, really is the activation word, if you will, of this entire era. So the Sons of Liberty, they are involved in the Boston Tea Party. They are involved in roughing up sort of pro-British officials. They are involved in doing a number of sort of terroristic things to the British government in the name of protecting the rights and the liberty, right, of the people who live in the colony. I want to talk to you very quickly just about the Boston Massacre. Many of us are familiar with many of the imagery associated with the Boston Massacre, and I can show you just a few. I like talking about this because the Boston Massacre, well, you can decide if you think it's a massacre or not. It does involve the British military shooting into the crowd in Boston. The first to die in this event is a free man of color, a teenager actually, and his name's Crispus Attucks. But this mob of people who emerge in Boston do so because they are convinced that they are being taken advantage of by the British. Oh, sorry. And are egging on the militia, for lack of a better phrase, and then they fire into the crowd. So 5 people die. And this was considered a massacre, even though the term itself was very much a propaganda tool in order to gin up support for the revolution, for going to war with England. Other events that are going on are things like the Tea Act. Of course, this is going to lead to the Boston Tea Party, the intolerable acts that are passed as a punishment for the Boston Tea Party, which of course included the Sons of Liberty dressed as indigenous people and busting open the tea into the harbor as an act of protest rather than pay the additional tax. They have a number of other acts that are being passed. So it was in this context that you have this group of colonial delegates coming together, representing different colonies, and really spreading this idea of revolution. Now, the majority of those who are organizing the revolution are the elites. Those who are going to fight in the revolution are going to be mostly poor. So the same class dynamic that is highly visible across the colonies are also very present in the militia that is going to be waging war. You can certainly take your time in going through all of this and the different battles and whatnot. I do want to sort of look at the differences between the British and the American colonists very quickly. So the British have a number of strengths, right? There are a number of British people. So they have a very large army. They are considered to have the best navy and the strongest military in the world. The British also, through a proclamation, attempt to free nearly 20,000 enslaved people in the Carolina and in Georgia. So they are able to create a they called them the Ethiopia regiment, to fight with them. So this is a considerable move by the British, and again are able to gain thousands of soldiers in this way. You also have a number of indigenous who fight alongside the British, thinking that that's the best bet for further encroachment. The British also hire about 50,000 professional military from around Europe. These people are known as Hessians. They're mercenaries. They're paid to fight. And also have about 50,000 loyalists in the colonies that are dedicated to maintaining British rule. So the British have a number of advantages in this war. The weaknesses of the British Empire and the British military are also significant. They have an enormous distance from the colonies, right? So the idea is typically you're going to fight harder if it's your backyard. So the colonists certainly have a home field advantage. America is too large to effectively maintain and control. So this is something that they will struggle in order to do. The British generals in America were pretty poor leaders. They don't have a lot of supplies. And the Americans have an alliance with France. So on the American side, they have strong leadership. They have an economic ally in France and a military ally. And of course, the French and the British have been at war with each other for hundreds of years. So the French are willing to provide services to defeat their enemy. You also have a lot of colonials, as I said before, who are very astute at guns, marksmanship, and they know how to fight. So that also was an advantage. Many of the weaknesses, however, of the American Revolution, we often think of many of these events as being preordained by God. That it could have only gone one way. And there are a number of reasons why this American militia should have lost. They're badly organized in terms of war and in terms of popular support. They are fighting the war without doing much to shore up any sort of constitution or plan as to what to do after the war is over. There is a lot of tension amongst different colonies and different regions. They have a lot of variation throughout the colony, so things are not standardized, and that makes it very difficult to organize. There are military challenges, and of course, some people are profiting off of this as well. So there are a number of things that we might look at to demonstrate why America should have lost this war. But obviously, we know who did. The United States will be victorious in winning this. It will immediately set up a new constitution that excludes women, that does not abolish slavery, even though there are many attempts to do so during the American Revolution. And the Zinn textbook does an excellent job of highlighting what some of those events are and the efforts of Black communities, free people, to try to abolish slavery as the colonials are going to war against England. This will also be the same constitution that then enacts through law the 3/5 rule, which also not only has implications in terms of law, but also devalues and immoralizes people of color. So there are a number of choices that could have been made in order to create a more equal and civilly just society that are ignored. So as you can imagine, those exclusions from not abolishing slavery to not dealing with the issue of indigenous rights and citizenships, denying women the right to vote or be citizens, we will see the next 60 years, if not the next 100 years of American history attempting to solve or address those problems. You also have the continuous issue of rebellion. One more thing, and then I'll end it. Right after the Constitution is ratified, we see an immediate rebellion. So this is really interesting for a number of reasons. But this rebellion, Shays' Rebellion, is led by poor farmers, those who fought in the colonial militia, who were waiting to get paid, never got paid. They have high taxes to pay and don't have the money because they did not get paid from the government in the way that they were promised. So, in the spirit of the American Revolution, they turned those guns on this new American government. And the outcome of which is fairly interesting. This will be a war, or rather a rebellion, that shows that there is lots of issues within the American military. It will not be the last time American soldiers protest against their government. There is a long history of that as well. Daniel Shay is the leader of this movement, and he really sees the government not acting in the way that it was supposed to. In the spirit of the revolution. Daniel Shay is, most of them are participants in the rebellion. There are about some 4,000 who actually signed confessions acknowledging their participation. Most are pardoned, but 18 are sentenced to death. 2 are hanged for thievery, and many of the others are pardoned. But it sets up a nice, or rather an ongoing issue between those who fight for the American government and the ways the American government rather poorly compensates those in the military. So thank you for listening and reviewing this information. I will see you all back in class next week. Thank you.